attending. In person, we have a number of our current doctoral students. We also have myself, actually I guess I probably should introduce myself, Garrett Smith. So I'm Garrett Smith. I am introducing Gary Danforth, who is defending his dissertation this afternoon. What can I say about Gary? I guess the biggest thing I would say about Gary is he has always been a hard worker and committed to his studies and to the project that he's presenting. Early on when we discussed his ideas, my only concern was what he wanted to do would require a lot of hand collecting of data. And I didn't know if someone was really going to have the level of commitment required to make it happen. But a few months in, he convinced me that it wasn't going to be a problem, and the rest, as they say, is history. So I want to invite him up, and I will let him get going.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Smith. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gary Danforth. Today I will be presenting my dissertation on enterprise risk management, essays on community bank adoption, performance, and risk shift. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge my dissertation committee, Dr. Smith, who has been my chair and advisor throughout this process. We started working together now over 2 years ago. Really appreciate all that you've done and your guidance, as well as Dr. Prempty, who has advised me significantly on this project and really helped provide the direction for many of the essays, and Dr. Jeffrey Nijad, who's joining us remotely today, provided substantial feedback and direction as the reader for this dissertation. I also want to thank Dr. Paraboutier, who is the DBA program director, for just being a mentor for over 3 years now. It's been a great experience being at Whitewater. The DBA faculty have been fantastic, as well as my DBA classmates, specifically cohort 8. I know many of them are probably watching this right now, and it's been a great experience so far. As far as myself, my background is in enterprise risk management, banking, financial services. Currently right now, I am a principal consultant in this area. My prior roles working in industry, I have been the vice president of ERM, senior director of ERM, global director of ERM, almost in every position reporting directly into the chief risk officer or some other similar role like that. As far as my education goes, my background is focused in accounting, banking, finance. So this really is the culmination of both my career as well as my educational background. So let's get into it. The motivation for this research obviously comes from my career. I have nearly 20 years experience, 19 years now, doing this type of work. And what I've noticed is there's a lot of challenges around enterprise risk management. There's a lot of regulatory pressures. There's a one-size-fits-all type of approach that often causes first-generational programs to fail. They're not right-sized or scoped properly sometimes, which can cause challenges, not for all institutions, but for some institutions. And the other one is community banking. And I will explain very shortly what a community bank is, but why do we care about community banks? Community banks are smaller banks. They are the primary small business lenders in the United States. They are the primary agricultural lenders in the United States. And they're dealing with a lot of increased compliance costs nowadays. There's a lot of consolidation that's happening. When I got into banking in 2005, there were around 10,000 banks in the United States. Today, there are about 4,800. So that just gives you an idea over the last 2 decades how much consolidation has happened in this industry. So what we'll be looking at today is I'm going to go through a couple definitions. We're going to look at some related literature. I'll go into the research method and the sample design, and then we'll jump into the essays. We're really going to try to focus more on the results in this presentation, but just to give you some background, we will hit some foundational concepts. So what is enterprise risk management? We may have heard the term. Not a lot of people may know what that is. Inherently, we understand what risk is. That just happens to be who we are as people. We live our lives every day, and whether or not we know it, we're making risk decisions all the time. Enterprise risk management is a strategy that is enacted typically by the board of directors or an executive committee in cooperation with a board, where it breaks down silos of risk. So you can have financial risk, compliance risk, liquidity risk, credit risk, and so on. In a traditional risk management structure, those risks are managed individually. In an enterprise risk management structure, you typically have a chief risk officer or another similar title, and what they do is they aggregate those risks together into a risk appetite statement using metrics, and what happens is the board of directors sets the actual risk appetite for what are called tier 1 risk domains, typically. And then they measure basically the risk with that appetite. Community banks are depository institutions that are less than 10 billion in assets. So community banks are not large banks that we often see associated or know about. They actually represent 97% of the depository institutions in the United States. So this dissertation does not focus on large banks. What we were focusing on are really the 97% population that are less than 10 billion in asset size. As far as background goes for the literature in this area, there are different research work streams, and there's 3 of them that we're hitting on in this essay. The first one is on enterprise risk management adoption. Why do community banks adopt ERM? Prior literature shows that larger companies tend to adopt ERM, those with more leverage, those with greater standard deviation of returns, greater earnings volatility. Those firms tend to adopt ERM, and that's backed by multiple studies, as you can see here on the right-hand side. Asset opacity was tested in these essays. It has not been found to be significant. However, what this basically says is that larger, more riskier firms tend to adopt enterprise risk management. The second essay in my dissertation is on performance. What happens post-ERM adoption? Research shows that firms that adopt enterprise risk management have increased return on assets, increased Tobin's Q, increased return on equity, reduced cost of capital, increased shareholder stock returns. So a lot of positive benefits to adopting enterprise risk management. Of course, a lot of the research that has been performed has been primarily on the insurance industry or using broad firm samples. Ironically, banking, which is a high adopter of enterprise risk management, there's very few studies that have been done on this topic, and no studies, to my knowledge, have ever been done on ERM in the community banking industry. What you'll see here is risk mitigation. This is the third essay in the dissertation. There is a small research stream around ERM and risk mitigation outcomes. Does it risk increase or does it decrease? Very little research has actually been done in this area, and much more is needed in the future. But generally speaking, what we know of the limited research is ERM has reduced operational risk events for firms, reduced firm stock return volatility, as well as reduced firm default risk. So what we do know about ERM from the limited studies is that ERM does produce more performance for larger firms in general, and it also does reduce risk. So the primary questions that we're asking is, if large firms are more likely to adopt enterprise risk management, what community bank characteristics correlate to adoption? You know, what drives these smaller firms to adopt ERM? They don't have the traditional profile of a firm that normally would implement this type of strategy. So that's the first question. The second question looks at larger firms are shown to perform better post-ERM adoption, but do community banks realize the same phenomenon? Do they also experience an increase in performance? And the third and final main question is, what happens to community bank risk profiles post-ERM adoption? Is there a risk reduction effect? So we'll be answering these questions today. And what we're going to do is, before we jump into the results, we're going to go through real quick the research model and sample data. This is a three-part, three-study dissertation. The first study, as I had mentioned, focused on ERM adoption. And what you can see here for the independent variables, we're looking at things like size, capital, leverage, earnings, volatility, non-interest income, beta, standard deviation of returns, and opacity. Excluding, well, all those variables represent certain risk proxies that are pretty standard in finance. We are controlling for a primary regulator. We're not looking at regulatory coercion or anything like that in these studies. And we're also controlling for random effects and fixed year effects in this first study. We do have time invariant variables in here, so that's why we're controlling it with random effects. The second study looks at performance. So this is post-enterprise risk management adoption. What happens to these community banks' performance afterwards? What you'll notice is for our dependent variables, we have some pretty classic financial measures of performance here. We have the capital asset pricing model. We have the famous French four-factor model, buy and hold abnormal returns, total Q, which in this case we're actually using Tobin's Q, we're using total Q, return on assets, and also return on equity. The Q, ROA, and ROE are pretty common in ERM performance studies. Ironically, not a lot of them cover these other financial measurements. As far as what we're looking at here for our variable of interest, that is really ERM, post-adoption, what happens to performance. The third essay here, we're looking at risk shift. So we are down here right now. So post-ERM adoption, what happens to the risk profile of those banks? So Essay 1 looks at the risk profile and why they adopt. Essay 2 looks at the risk profile after adoption. We also are looking at two independent variables here. We have ERM, and we also have maturity. So we're looking at short-term after adoption and also long-term sustainable risk shift. The data collection for this, Dr. Smith had mentioned this before. I manually collected this data from August of 22 to January of 24. I did not know if we were going to have results from these studies, so it was a little bit of a risk, but I was very adamant that this is what I wanted to do for my dissertation. But the study period is from 1997 to 2020, so that's a 23-year study period. The data sources here come from CompuStat, CRISP, SEC Edgar was used to identify the ERM adoption activities by looking at financial statements. I looked at thousands of financial statements to collect this data and create a panel data set. And FDIC.gov was used to identify the primary regulator and the bank's age. As far as the samples go, initially there was 182 public community banks that were included in the sample. Depending on the study, data availability, and what we were looking at as far as what was the requirement for the models, SA1 has 135 community banks, SA2 has 161 community banks, and SA3, which there are two analyses in here, has 63 and 73 community banks. As far as an ERM study goes, the study period is one of the longest study periods done of any ERM study. Most of these studies, because the data is so hard to collect and to really analyze, typically are from 1 to 5 years. The sample is also very large. Most of these studies typically have anywhere between 30 to 80, again, because they have to manually review these firms. There is no secondary data source for ERM adoption. As far as the adoption results go, what you're looking at here is when the sample community banks adopted ERM. We can see in 1999 we had really our first adoption in the sample. I actually started the sample in 2005 and had to go back to 2009 in order to find the first year of adoption. You also see in 2009 and 2010, there's a huge spike here after 2018. That most definitely was caused by the Great Recession. A lot of regulation was passed at that time. As of today, 57% of community banks, at least within the sample population, have adopted ERM. Now we're going to get into the results. So the first essay is on adoption. the adoption results that we're looking at here, there are two hypotheses. The first one deals with the larger the size of a community bank, the more likely they are to adopt ERM. The second one looks at characteristics. This is a non-directional hypothesis where we're looking at the risk profile of that firm to determine which firms are more likely to adopt enterprise risk management. For those interested, this is a logic model that we're looking at here. The descriptive statistics on this study, you're going to notice that these firms are generally not risky to begin with. They're very well capitalized, they have low leverage, they have low earnings volatility, low beta, low opacity. Generally speaking, community banks and smaller banks in general are very safe institutions. They provide a lot of stability within the banking industry, and that is backed by empirical literature. So generally speaking, they're not super risky firms to begin with. They're generally very conservative. The main model adoption results, there were three variables that were significant. The first one being earnings volatility was positive and significant. Non-interest income was positive and significant, and beta was also positive and significant. We did not want to take these results as is. I wanted to do some robustness tests on these results to make sure that they were really accurate. And so what I did is I did two robustness tests with non-ERM banks compared to ERM community banks. So the first robustness test that you see here dealt with non-ERM banks that may have adopted ERM in the future, but these banks were matched based on their asset size and their age. So we took ERM community banks, non-ERM community banks, matched them on size and age. The non-ERM community banks in the robustness test 1 could have adopted ERM in the future. So that was the first test. The second test included non-ERM banks that never adopted within the sample period. And I did that to just make sure and double check that there wasn't some other influence going on in the background here. As you can see, earnings volatility was significant and positive in all three of these models. I then did some randomized multicollinearity tests. There were 10 tests that I basically took these variables and put them in different models and randomized them to make sure that multicollinearity wasn't causing some of these results. So what I also found in doing this is that earnings volatility was significant in 4 out of the 5 randomized models. Non-interest income was significant in 7 out of the 8 randomized models. Beta was insignificant in the main model, but not in the robustness test, not in any model at all. And size, which was not significant in the main model, was actually significant in 10 out of 10 models. So what this is telling us is earnings volatility, non-interest income, and size are significant in this study. The VIF review for multicollinearity, I did run a regression test. The regression results are not specific to this study, so the results don't really count. But I did want to look at the VIFs, and none are above 10 and none are above 3, in fact. So the key takeaways here, the larger the size of the community bank, the more likely they are to adopt ERM. That was true. Community bank characteristics that have a significant impact on enterprise risk management adoption include higher earnings volatility and higher non-interest income. So the key findings here are that community bank adoption first occurred, at least with this sample, in 1999, and we saw in the sample population that accelerated really after 2008. Our other key finding here goes back to the hypothesis is that community banks that are larger and those that with riskier profiles are more likely to adopt ERM. That second key finding is consistent with established empirical literature that's been performed on larger institutions. Next, we're going to look at SA2, which is their performance results. So there are 2 hypotheses in this essay, and they are competing hypotheses. The first one is that community bank ERM adoption has a positive effect on performance. The second one is it has a negative effect on performance. You are going to see a main regression model in here and also a parsimonious regression model, and I'll explain why in a moment I did that. The descriptive statistics that you're seeing here, I just want to point out that the financial variables were run monthly. BHAR was run using the ERM banks that had adopted ERM. There were 55 of them that we used as an event, and the accounting variables as well as the risk proxies are run on an annualized basis. So you will see a difference in observations. I just do want to point that out as we look at the tables here. The univariate tests that we're looking at show a lot of significant results around performance in ERM adoption. The univariate tests are absent of any controls. We're not controlling for size, fixed effects, fixed year effects, risk, we're not controlling for anything. So absent of ERM, what we're seeing here is for CAPM and FEMA French, they actually had an increased performance. You will notice a negative T value here. That is because we are subtracting the mean before from the mean after. So because the mean after is larger, it gives a negative number which is producing that negative T value. So in the case of this univariate test here, specifically the means and the rank sum test, the negative T and Z score are a positive indicator. Now when we add in controls, we're looking at the main results now. This is the main model. What you're going to notice up on top for ERM is for all the financial measurements that we're looking at here for performance, all of them are negative. So I ran a tiered model approach to see basically why it flipped from positive to negative. As soon as you start adding in controls and you start controlling for size, fixed year effects, fixed firm effects, that positive performance turns negative. As far as significance goes, CAPM 12 months, 18 months, and 24 months were significant and negative. We'll look at the economic impact of this in a moment. The parsimonious results, I'm showing some of the models here, but basically what I did with the main model is there's a lot of variables in there that really are not significant. So we don't want to cloud the model with things that really don't mean that much in the long run. So what I did is I took capital, size, capital, beta as a risk measurement, for example, and ran a more simplistic model. This is really for people who want to run a model, researchers who want to run a model, to have something that's a little bit more simplistic and to get the same result. And that's really what this is showing, even by removing some of those variables that maybe not had much of an effect on the model, we're still showing that CAPM was significant and negative. The main results for buy and hold abnormal returns, same thing. I ran a t-test on 55 ERM firms that had adopted ERM and looked to see if basically BHAR was greater than 0. And what it actually was is it was negative. Specifically, BHAR 12 at the 12-month mark was negative 8.5%. That represents about a $38 million loss in shareholder value when we control for risk. So while some of these ERM firms may have had what looked like to be greater performance, we can't really attribute that to ERM because ERM is meant to impact the risk profile of the firm. And what we're seeing here is that when we control for that risk, that performance increase actually goes away and it actually becomes negative. SA2 main findings. The first hypothesis that community bank ERM adoption has a positive effect on performance. Unfortunately, we do have to reject that. I did not find any evidence that that was true. The second one, that community bank ERM adoption has a negative effect on performance, we do have to accept that because that is what the data is telling us. So the key findings and takeaways from this second essay is that without controlling for things like size, risk, fixed effects, ERM appears to have a positive effect on firm community bank performance. When we measure and we control for risk proxies, for example, and we measure using CAPM, ERM's economic loss for community bank shareholder value is anywhere between $16 to $35 million, 12 to 24 months after adoption. Measured by BHAR, ERM's economic loss for a community bank shareholder value is about $38 million after 12 months. And also, if we measure by BHAR, riskier ERM community banks had the lowest BHAR for investors. So the more risk those community banks had, the lower investor returns were. Next, we're going to look at the third and final study, risk shift results. So when I say risk shift, we're for those that may not be familiar with that term, we're looking at the risk profile and how it shifts. It either increases or it decreases. So to start with, there are two hypotheses in this essay. One is that ERM community banks will have significantly reduced risk shift following ERM adoption. The second one looks at maturity. So the first hypothesis was tested using 5 years. It was a balanced panel data set, so we have 5 years. We have 2 years before ERM adoption, the year that the firm adopted ERM, and 2 years after ERM adoption. The second hypothesis looks at maturity, long-term adoption. So not just 2 years after, but 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 16 years after. Some of the samples in my data set had at least up to 16 years that they had adopted ERM. So I wanted to see, well, even if it had a positive or negative effect the first 2 years, what happens long-term? So that's what these questions and these hypotheses are and what we're going to answer right now. And there are two models here. There's a main model and then there's a maturity model. Descriptive statistics here are very similar to study one, but again, we can see starting out, these firms really are not that risky, very stable institutions, again, just generally not that much risk here for these firms. The univariate test, when I ran this, I was pretty surprised. It was very consistent. Non-interest income was significant, even though it shows a negative T and Z score here. Again, that indicates it actually went up. Non-interest income are non-traditional bank activities. They tend to be fee-based. Consumers tend to shop around for these types of products, so they don't represent long-term profitability. They're more like short-term fee-based, non-sticky products. So therefore, in banking, their non-interest income is considered a more riskier type of risk proxy. Again, we're seeing that consistency here, that non-interest income went up after ERM adoption. The main results here that we're looking at, very consistent here, what you'll see is earnings volatility and standard deviation of returns were positive and significant. Now, risk is idiosyncratic, so things can go up and represent a risk increase or decrease, and things can go down and represent a risk increase or decrease. In this case, with earnings volatility and standard deviation of returns being positive and significant going up, that represents a significant increase in risk here. As far as economically, what this means is earnings volatility increased 16% and standard deviation of returns increased 15%, and that was 2 years after ERM adoption. The ERM maturity results, again, this is looking at long-term adoption. We're finding consistent results here. Earnings volatility significant and positive, standard deviation of return significant and positive. Long-term, what this means is that earnings volatility increased about 27%. So increased after 2 years and continued to increase. Standard deviation of returns also increased around approximately 10% long-term. So increased a little bit more the first 2 years, but long-term still had a sustained risk increase. The robustness test here, I did a propensity score match with non-ERM firms and took those non-ERM firms with the ERM community banks, put them together and ran the model to see if I still produced the same results using propensity score matching. These banks were specifically matched on size as well as on their risk profiles. Again, we're seeing consistent results here. So earnings volatility, significant and positive, standard deviation, significant and positive. Again, when we look at the results comparison from the main results, the ERM maturity results, the matched firm robustness test, it's consistent across all three. I did a follow-up analysis on the difference between early adopters versus late adopters. There was a researcher, Jabor, who did a similar study finding that earlier adopters were more driven by strategy versus late adopters that were more driven by regulatory coercion, essentially. What I found is there's a bit of a mixture here. So earlier ERM adopters are those that adopted 2007 or before. And the reason I chose that year is because based on the data, we saw that huge uptick in 2008 and 9, 10, most likely generated by the Great Recession, and that was probably what influenced that adoption. So I wanted to look at before. And we're finding a little bit of a mixture here. So leverage decreased, earnings volatility, we're showing negative here, but this is a univariate test that did increase in standard deviation of returns increase. So leverage decreasing was good, but there's a little bit of risk going up, risk going down, so it's a little bit of a mixture. The late adopters had no results showing any risk decrease. It's only showing risk increase in earnings volatility, non-interest income, and standard deviation of returns. So the main findings, this was a surprise finding in this essay. Again, I had hypothesized that risk would go down, and that tends to be the general consensus within the industry and academia. ERM is a way, it's a strategy at its base to identify risk, mitigate risk, stabilize operations, increase performance. What I found in this essay is actually the opposite, that ERM significantly increases risk as measured by earnings volatility by 16% and standard deviation by 15%, at least 2 years after adoption. And that long-term earnings volatility increased 27% and standard deviation of returns increased 10%, resulting in sustained and increased long-term risk for community banks. The early versus late adopters, what this is showing is that early community bank adopters experienced a mixture of risk increase and decrease, so it was a mixture of it. The late adopters experienced a risk increase, and there was no evidence of a risk decrease here. And finally, late community bank ERM adopters pursued riskier non-traditional bank activities, meaning non-interest income. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do a recap, and we're going to look at what is the storytelling. Essay 1 was on adoption. So we looked at the adoption results, and what we saw is ERM community banks adopted first really around 1999, at least from this sample population, which I think is pretty representative of the industry. And that it accelerated after 2007, most likely because of the Great Recession. I don't think we need a study to prove that. Community banks that are larger and those that are more riskier are significantly more likely to adopt ERM. So Essay 1 actually fits well within existing literature of what has been found, except what we're looking at now is at a small firm sample. You know, we're not looking at large insurance companies or global banks, we're looking at community banks here. So it's interesting to see that that still holds true for this smaller population. Essay 2, we looked at post-ERM adoption performance. What we find is ERM has a significant negative effect on community bank market performance. Riskier ERM community banks had lower performance, and that economically ERM represented anywhere from 16 million to 38 million in lost shareholder value within 1 to 2 years. The third essay looked at the risk shift of the profile of these community banks. What we found is risk significantly increased 2 years after community bank adoption, and that risk continued to increase sustained long term. And also risk significantly increases for late ERM community bank adopters who pursued more riskier non-traditional bank activities. So overall, what we're looking at here is larger, riskier community banks adopt ERM. Their performance goes down and their risk profile goes up. Now, what I will say is that while this is generalizable to the sample population, does this mean that ERM is bad? Does it mean that it's bad for the industry? Does it mean that it's bad for community banks? What I will say is that there is a challenge with adopting these programs and getting value out of them. There are various reasons why I could give. I could talk about this for the next 6 hours. I have seen ERM work really well for some community banks, even ones that I have worked for, extremely profitable, very much up to date on their risk appetites and what they're doing. I have also seen companies, both large, moderate, and small, that have really struggled in this area. So I think really what it is looking at enterprise risk management for community banks and how do we make it work? What's the right type of framework for them? What's the right type of scope? How do they get value out of enterprise risk management in a way that works for them? And I really think that the next phase of the research that I would like to do is really exploring that topic. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Gary. I believe we are good on time for questions.
Yes.
So I saw my colleague, Dr. Primpty, taking some notes. So I'll open the floor to him first.
Thank you, Gary. Great presentation, as I expected. Everybody has 6 hours, right? Should we let Gary speak for 6 hours for ERM? No, I'm just joking. I have a couple general questions and a couple suggestions. First of all, I really like that you brought it together in the end, together all the essays, all the findings. Given your study and your experience in ERM implementation on banks, what would you say was your most expected result, and what result were you most surprised by?
Ooh. The most expected result was that larger community banks adopted ERM, and that's because there's a cost associated to it. Smaller, micro-sized community banks, typically like less than, let's say, 500 million in asset size, it probably is very difficult for them to implement this strategy. So I was expecting size to be significant, which I was not expecting in the main result that it was not significant, so I'm glad we did the follow-up multicollinearity robustness test because it actually showed that it was significant. The most unexpected result probably was that ERM actually had a negative impact on the firm's risk. So I had hypothesized in the third essay that ERM would reduce risk. I thought that maybe it could have some mixture there, but I was not expecting to see across the board that it had a general overall just a negative effect.
Yeah, that was interesting. That basically, first study shows that the banks with higher earnings volatility are more likely to adopt ERM. So you'd think that'd be trying to reduce it, but then the third essay find that it goes higher. So a couple suggestions I have. For the first essay, when you label tables of the regression, instead of labeling them as a robustness test 1 or 2, maybe say the sample, which specific subsample that is, that makes it easier to read. In essay 2, it's surprising, and we kind of talked about it before, that the univariate test shows risk decreasing, but then the multivariate shows risk increasing. I think it would be, I mean, not the risk, the performance, sorry.
Yeah, performance, yep.
Yeah, performance is greater in prior and then it decreases when you run the multi. So I'm trying to square them, so I think maybe a follow-up study or a follow-up test would be to maybe have maybe quintiles of size or quintiles of risk and see what happens to performance on each quintile.
Mm-hmm.
So that might kind of help you dig deeper, or where is the greater performance coming from and where is the lowest performance coming from. Maybe it's in one of those quintiles, and that'll help you maybe tell a better story.
Yep.
And on SA3, going to maybe to dig deeper, as I mentioned it earlier, would be to create those dummies for each specific year, starting maybe 3 years before. So you have a dummy for year -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it kind of tells you the story of where the risk reduction happens or risk increase happens. So maybe in first 2 years we see a risk decrease, and then maybe after 3 years we see a risk increase.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are the only comments I had. Other than that, great job, great presentation.
Thank you. Very, very relevant. Yes, I appreciate that.
Dr. Jafarinejad, do you have questions?
Hi, or buonasera from where I am. So, Gary, congratulations. Thank you for doing a great job with especially the presentation today. So, way to go. Sorry that I cannot be there in person, but I'm there in spirit and I guess with the video. So I hope that's sufficient. I think overall, it was a really good study, especially having the hand-collected data, as Garrett mentioned. It's not an easy task, so I was very much impressed to see that when I was reading your proposal and also your final work, and overall showing the impact of ERM adoption on the community bank, which hasn't been seen. One of the things that I noticed, as Aryan mentioned, was something that we also see in another paper that we have, that univariate results and multivariate results, there is a little bit of a mismatch with increase or decrease, right? So I had the same comment actually to use either quartile or quantile regression to see if where the impact comes from. So we should have those results, I would say, consistent if you run those regressions. Other than that, I think for SA3, I think your SA3 is the most interesting part because the results are actually not what you expect, right? You hope that ERM would turn out to be in terms of the rest shift that you're looking at, right? So what you're producing is actually really interesting because it's challenging the typical narrative. But I think we need to look into it more. So I think what Dr. Premti mentioned, looking into some dummy variables, looking into when I think this impact comes from would be very interesting. But other than the comments, which most of them were minor, I would say cosmetic that I provided when I read your dissertation, I don't have anything major essentially to add at this point. So way to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I will look at creating those quartiles and the dummy variables as well. There's still a little bit more work to do, obviously, with some of the feedback, but yeah, I look very much into incorporating this feedback. Thank you.
Dr. Peru. So I think from a presentation standpoint, and this echoes my colleagues' comments already, what we may need to do, not for a dissertation, but for a paper, is probably combine study 1 and 3 together, and then maybe look a little deeper at the second paper. But I think that the story is, particularly the performance story, is interesting when we take a step back. So we see, and if we put ourselves, I think, in management's shoes, we can say, well, adoption of ERM is not exogenous. You know, the committee or the CEO, the board of directors is deciding to make a choice to enter into this dysfunction. And so strategically, I think what we're finding is the larger banks that are already somewhat riskier compared to their peers, they are electing to engage in ERM, but it seems like they're doing this because they have intentions to actually take on more risk. So they want to perhaps better understand how much risk that they can actually manage. And so if we think about it from a finance perspective, well, if risk increases, performance should increase. But if we look at performance just in a vacuum, it goes up, but the banks were engaging in more risk, and so it seems like there isn't a payoff, or there isn't an appropriate payoff for the level of risk that they're taking on after they start the program. So I think that is interesting. I also appreciate that you gave a little bit of an industry perspective in addition to just the academic findings. Yeah, I mean, I guess that was really just more comments than questions, but I appreciate your time. I certainly want to open it to the floor. Praveen gave me a thumbs up, so you're good.
Yes, I'm good.
Yeah. I'll bring the mic back for you.
Excellent job. I think we all want to clap very loudly for you. Given that your results were so surprising to you, did you find bias or any limitations in your original research?
So there are limitations with this research. One of them being is that this study was not performed on non-public community banks. So it may or may not be generalizable to non-public community banks, although they are very similar. I mean, we're looking at the same asset size, they're in the same community type of demographics and stuff. As far as other limitations go, there is a limitation with the CRO proxy method that I used. So with the CRO proxy method, there's ways that researchers identify adoption in ERM. It can be through hiring announcements. It could be through financial statements, which is what I did use. It could be through case studies, surveys, and so on and so forth. In the hiring announcements and in the financial analysis, statement analysis, there is a possibility where the firm adopted ERM, but they didn't disclose it to the public or didn't disclose it in the financial statements. I did not use hiring announcements specifically because these are smaller firms. So there's an internal validity issue with doing that because they don't receive as much attention as larger firms do. I used financial statements because it's more of an accurate depiction of if they adopted ERM because we could see it coming from the board and the executive committee as far as what's being reported in the financial statements. So because it is a board initiative and typically you have a chief risk officer, you have an enterprise risk committee, it's very apparent when looking at the financial statements and using keyword searches that they adopted ERM. That being said, there is a limitation in that CRO proxy where you could have a firm that adopted, they didn't state it in their financial statements, they didn't state it in the public, so you could categorize an ERM firm as being non-ERM. I think that's not really a material concern in these studies, but it is a notable limitation to the CRO proxy, and I do think it's actually more of a concern if you're using hiring announcements in that case.
Gary, great work on your presentation. Very inspiring for those of us who are still trying to get there. Quick question for you. You noted on 2008, shortly after the recession, that we saw a spike in ERM. Did you find in your study that any of that was correlated to government regulation or interpretation of government regulation of why we saw that spike or continued to see some growth in that?
Thank you for that question. It's an interesting question. So there were other data that I had looked at collecting around regulatory guidance. So banks are regulated, at least community banks, by typically 3 primary regulators. You have the OCC, the Fed, and the FDIC. The FDIC is the primary regulator of community banks. The Fed and the OCC each regulate around 20%, and then the FDIC regulates the other 60. They issue what's called regulatory guidance, supervisory letters, bulletins, and what I wanted to do was create a regulatory type of concept variable that measured the amount of risk management guidance that they had issued to see if that affected their regulated entities, those being community banks, their adoption. So I looked at thousands of regulatory guidance and supervisory letters and discovered that one of the regulators, when they replace a regulatory guidance, they actually remove it from the website and you have to submit a, I forget the name of it, it's basically you have to submit a request to get it. So unfortunately it was not possible to include that in the adoption essay, even though I had put a substantial amount of work into collecting that data. But basically what I was going to do is identify this regulator had X, Y, Z percentage of regulatory guidance, this one had that, and that one had that, to see if that actually had an effect on their adoption. I would love to run that study. It's a Freedom of Information Act or something like that. But unfortunately the data was not available. So, but it's a great question, so thank you for asking that. Yeah.
Okay, that looks like it is it for questions. Any other questions from, okay. All right.
He knows more than I do.
All right, well, thank you, Gary.